It was just after 8 o'clock on a damp Tuesday evening when the phone rang, only a few hours earlier. I'd authorized another bank transfer. £8,000. Watching the confirmation appear on my screen had filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Hope. Excitement. In less than a fortnight, the woman I believed I'd spend the rest of my life with was finally coming to Britain. Every pound, I told myself, was simply helping us reach the beginning we'd both waited so long for. When the phone lit up on the coffee table, I smiled before I'd even looked at the number. I assumed it was her. I'd already imagined hearing her laugh as she apologized for missing my last message. She always sounded warmer in the evenings. We'd probably spend another hour talking about where we'd go first once she arrived. Whitby. Maybe the Norfolk coast. Somewhere quiet, where neither of us had to explain what loneliness felt like. I answered with that thought still in my head. Hello? There was a brief pause. Then a calm, measured voice. Good evening. Sir. My name's Sergeant Collins. I'm calling from Nottinghamshire Police. Is this Mr. Harrison? For a moment I thought there must have been some mistake. Yes. That's me. Thank you. I'm afraid I need to ask you a rather important question. His voice remained gentle, almost apologetic. Sir. How well do you actually know the woman you've been sending money to? Everything around me seemed to stop. The television carried on muttering in the corner of the room, but I couldn't hear a word of it. Steam drifted lazily from the mug of tea beside my chair until, before I realized it, the surface had gone completely still. I gripped the arm of the sofa. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I think you've got the wrong person. We don't believe we have. No. There must be some misunderstanding. My mouth had gone dry. We speak every day. I understand. We're planning our future. I appreciate that's what you believe. And she loves me. The words escaped before I could stop them. She loves me. She had to. 3 years earlier, I'd buried my wife after 42 years together. I never imagined another woman would ever matter to me again. Then, somehow, against every expectation I'd ever had, someone had walked gently into the emptiness I'd been carrying. She listened. She remembered things I'd forgotten telling her. She knew how difficult anniversaries could be. She made me laugh without trying. For months we'd shared our mornings, our evenings, our hopes for the years we thought we still had left. I trusted her with my heart, long before I trusted her with my savings. I'd already sent tens of thousands of pounds. But none of it had felt reckless at the time. It had felt like helping the woman I loved through a string of dreadful misfortunes before we could finally begin our life together. The officer allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. Mr. Harrison, please don't send another penny until you've heard what we've discovered. I thanked him almost automatically and ended the call. The room was suddenly very quiet. Then, my mobile vibrated. A message from her. I unlocked the screen. Without thinking, my thumb drifted towards the banking app. Was the police officer trying to protect me? Or destroy the only happiness I'd found since losing my wife? I couldn't bring myself to open her message straight away. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the coffee table and stared through the front window. The street outside looked exactly as it always did. A few lights glowed behind curtains. Someone walked their dog past the garden gate. Nothing had changed. Yet somehow everything had. The officer's words kept circling in my mind. How well do you actually know the woman you've been sending money to? I wanted to dismiss them, but they refused to leave. Perhaps that's why my thoughts drifted back to where all of this had really begun. 3 years earlier. My wife, Margaret, had died after a long illness. 42 years we'd been together. When you've shared that much of your life with someone, you don't simply lose a person. You lose your routines, your conversations, even the little habits you never noticed until they're gone. The house became painfully quiet. Every morning I still reached automatically for 2 mugs before remembering I only needed one. I'd make my tea, carry it into the conservatory, and find myself looking towards the chair where Margaret always sat to read the paper. It stayed empty. Some mornings, I almost expected her to walk in and complain that I'd made the tea too strong again. Instead, all I could hear was the ticking of the kitchen clock. People often asked how I was managing. "Oh, I'm getting by," I'd tell them with a smile. It became such a familiar answer that eventually I almost believed it myself. Most days followed exactly the same pattern. I'd drive to Tesco for a few bits, though I rarely needed much. Cooking for one never seemed worth the effort. I'd wander the aisles longer than necessary, simply because there were other people around. Sometimes the cashier would ask whether I had any plans for the weekend. I'd reply, "Nothing exciting." Neither of us expected a longer conversation. Back home, I'd scatter seed across the garden for the birds. Margaret had loved watching the robins. They still came every morning, as though nothing had happened. After lunch, I'd walk through the local park, nodding politely at familiar faces. We all recognized one another without really knowing each other. A brief smile, a quiet morning. Then everyone continued on their own way. Loneliness doesn't always arrive with silence. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary days. My children rang when they could. My daughter usually called on Sundays. My son every week or two. The grandchildren were busy with work, university, and young families of their own. None of them neglected me. They were simply living the lives Margaret and I had always wanted them to have. I never wanted to become another obligation on their list. So I kept saying I was fine, even when I wasn't. Evenings were always the hardest. I'd watch quiz shows without really following the questions. Read the newspaper, only to realize half an hour later, I couldn't remember a single article. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking aloud. "Did you see that?" "Love." The words would leave my mouth before I remembered there was nobody there to answer. More than once I apologized to Margaret's photograph for forgetting she was gone. Sleep rarely came easily. When it finally did, I'd often wake around 3 in the morning, reaching across an empty mattress that still felt far too large. One rainy afternoon, while scrolling aimlessly through Facebook, I noticed an advert for a dating website aimed at people over 60. I almost laughed. "Bit late for all that," he muttered. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I created a profile. Nothing serious, I told myself. Just looking. Even pressing the button made me feel strangely guilty, as though I were somehow being unfaithful to Margaret. I nearly deleted the account before anyone could ever see it. Then, a few evenings later, a small notification appeared. One sample message. "Hello. I couldn't help noticing your smile." I stared at the screen for several minutes. My finger hovered over the delete button. Instead, I typed back, "Thank you. That's very kind of you." I pressed send before I could change my mind. At the time, it felt like the smallest decision imaginable. Looking back now, I often wonder whether that single click quietly changed the rest of my life. Her name was Elizabeth. At least, that's the name she gave me. Her profile photograph showed a woman of about 60 with kind eyes, silver blonde hair, and the sort of smile that looked genuine rather than carefully posed. She wasn't glamorous. That was probably what made her seem believable. Her first message had been simple. "I hope you don't mind me saying hello." Nothing more. No grand compliments. No dramatic introductions. Just a quiet greeting from someone who, she said, understood what it meant to start again later in life. I replied, because it felt rude not to. One message became 3. 3 became an evening. Before long, we were chatting almost every day. She told me she'd been widowed 4 years earlier. Her husband had died unexpectedly after suffering a heart attack. Some days, she admitted, she still reached across the bed expecting him to be there. I still talk to his photograph now and then. She confessed one evening. I smiled sadly. So do I. There was a pause before another message appeared. I thought I might be the only one. That sentence stayed with me. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt as though somebody truly understood the strange loneliness that people rarely spoke about. Elizabeth said she lived in Devon, in a small village not far from the coast. She loved gardening. So had Margaret. She enjoyed long walks by the sea, especially when the beaches were nearly empty. I admitted I'd always preferred the seaside in winter, less crowded. I wrote, and somehow more honest. She laughed. I've always thought exactly the same. Little by little, our conversations became part of my day. She'd send a cheerful message every morning. Hope you've slept well. I'd reply while the kettle was boiling. Sometimes we'd exchange photographs of flowers from our gardens. She showed me climbing roses. I sent pictures of the robins that still visited Margaret's bird table. When I mentioned I'd burned a shepherd's pie, she replied with her own recipe, insisting that Worcestershire sauce made all the difference. The following week I tried it. She was right. Those tiny moments mattered more than I realized. We weren't discussing great adventures. We were simply sharing ordinary life. Some evenings we'd spend an hour reminiscing about holidays we'd taken with our late spouses. There was never any awkwardness. Neither of us seemed threatened by the memories. Instead, they became something we understood about each other. Gradually, I noticed something changing. Without thinking, I'd smile when my phone buzzed. I'd find myself looking forward to hearing from her. The silence that had filled my evenings for years no longer felt quite so heavy. Even the neighbors commented, "You seem brighter these days." "David," Mrs. Wilson said, over the garden fence. "I suppose I am." I admitted, for once. I meant it. What struck me most was that Elizabeth never appeared to want anything from me. She asked about my day. She remembered my granddaughter's university interview. When I mentioned my arthritis was bothering me, she checked on me the following morning. "You sounded uncomfortable yesterday. Is your knee any better?" It was such a small thing, yet it meant the world. I hadn't realized how much I missed having someone notice. Weeks turned into months. Our conversation stretched from breakfast until bedtime. Good morning messages, photographs, recipes, stories about childhood. Occasionally, we'd laugh so much that I'd have to wipe tears from my eyes. Real laughter, the sort I'd thought I'd lost forever. Then, one quiet evening, after we'd been talking about nothing in particular, her voice became softer. I've never felt this close to anyone before. My heart began to beat a little faster. I looked around the empty sitting room before answering. Neither have I. Not since Margaret. There was a gentle silence between us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The strange thing was this. We had shared hundreds of conversations. We knew each other's favorite foods, favorite places, and favorite memories. Yet we had never once stood in the same room. As I switched off the bedside lamp that night, one question lingered in my mind. Could two lonely people really fall in love without ever having met face to face? From that evening onwards, Elizabeth became part of my everyday life in a way that happened so gradually I barely noticed it. We slipped into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Each morning, before I'd even drawn the curtains, my phone would buzz. "Good morning. Sleep well." I'd smile before replying. "Better than usual. How are you?" Some days she'd send a photograph of the sunrise over the Devon coastline. Other mornings it would be a robin perched outside her kitchen window, or a bunch of sweet peas she'd just picked from her garden. I'd answer with pictures of my roses or the tomatoes I was trying, with only modest success, to grow in the greenhouse. Margaret had always looked after. It felt comforting, ordinary, exactly the sort of conversation two people growing closer might have. As the weeks passed, we began speaking on video calls. At first they were only a few minutes long. She'd wave at the camera and laugh if the picture froze. "I think my internet has a mind of its own," she'd say, with an apologetic smile. The connection was never perfect. Sometimes the screen would become blurry. Sometimes her face would disappear altogether while her voice carried on. "It'll be this dreadful signal again," she'd sigh. I believed her without a second thought. After all, I'd had enough frustrating calls with my own grandchildren to know technology wasn't always reliable. when video calls failed completely. She'd leave voice notes instead. I found myself playing them back more than once. There was something reassuring about hearing someone say my name with such warmth. On my 69th birthday, a parcel arrived. Inside was a small silver necklace with a simple compass pendant. There was also a handwritten card. You deserve happiness again. Never forget that. I sat at the kitchen table holding it for several minutes. No one had given me something so thoughtful since Margaret died. To my own surprise, tears rolled quietly down my face. Not because of the necklace itself, because someone had thought about me. That evening I thanked Elizabeth. You've no idea what this means. I think I do. She replied softly. We've both spent enough years putting everyone else first. For the first time since becoming a widower, I opened the small drawer beside my bed and took out my wedding ring. I'd stopped wearing it after Margaret's funeral, but could never quite bring myself to put it away properly. Now I placed it gently into its box. It wasn't because I loved Margaret any less. It was because, for the first time in years, I felt she wouldn't want me to spend whatever life I had left on my own. Even my children noticed the difference. You seem happier, Dad, my daughter said over Sunday lunch. I suppose I am. It's lovely to hear you laughing again. I didn't tell her much about Elizabeth. Partly because the relationship still felt precious. Partly because I wanted to wait until we met in person. I imagined introducing them when the time was right. We spoke often about the future. Long walks along Whitby Beach with fish and chips wrapped in paper. Christmas together in my house, with far too much food and terrible cracker jokes. Meeting each other's families. Growing vegetables in the garden. Growing old without having to face another lonely evening. The dreams felt wonderfully ordinary. Perhaps that was why they seemed so real. Looking back now, there were moments I should have questioned. Every now and then she'd cancel a video call at the last minute. My camera's packed in again. Or she'd apologize because she was unexpectedly traveling abroad for work connected to an old consultancy contract. Once she claimed she'd dropped her phone and was borrowing another. None of it sounded impossible. Life has a habit of getting in the way. I'd experienced enough unexpected problems over the years to know that, whenever a small doubt crept into my mind, she'd somehow say exactly the right thing to make it disappear. Then, one Friday evening, she sounded more excited than I'd ever heard her. I've booked it, she said. What have you booked? My trip. I felt my heart skip. I'm finally coming to see you next month. For a moment I couldn't speak. After months of messages, calls, shared memories and dreams, the waiting was nearly over. That night I found myself counting the days on the calendar pinned to the kitchen wall. Only 4 weeks to go. Yet as I crossed off each passing day, one quiet question lingered in the back of my mind. Would Elizabeth really step off that train? Or was I waiting for someone who would never arrive? The first week after Elizabeth told me she was coming passed more quickly than I expected. Every morning I crossed another day off the calendar in the kitchen. It had been years since I'd looked forward to anything with quite so much excitement. I even found myself making little plans. I changed the bedding in the spare room, although she insisted she hoped we wouldn't need it. I tidied the garden, trimmed the roses, and finally painted the front gate. A job I'd been putting off for months. It felt good to have a reason. Elizabeth seemed just as excited. We'll have fish and chips on the seafront, she said during one of our evening calls. And I want to meet those robins you keep talking about. I laughed. They're terribly demanding. They'll expect feeding before they say hello. I think I'll manage. Those ordinary conversations made everything feel wonderfully real. But then, almost too quietly to notice, little things began to change. One evening, she mentioned she'd be traveling on Tuesday. The following day she referred to leaving on Thursday instead. I assumed I'd remembered wrongly. After all, memory isn't quite what it once was. A week later, she sent me a photograph of a harbor she claimed was near her home in Devon. Something about it felt familiar. 2 days afterwards, she sent another photograph from what looked like exactly the same place. Only this time, she said, it had been taken during a business trip abroad. I frowned for a moment. Then I shrugged it off. Perhaps she'd simply mixed the captions up. People do that. During one video call, I noticed the room behind her looked completely different from the one I'd seen the week before. When I asked whether she'd rearranged the furniture, she smiled. I'm staying with a friend for a few days. It sounded perfectly reasonable. I didn't think about it again. Whenever a small inconsistency appeared, there always seemed to be an explanation waiting close behind it. Life is untidy. Plans change. People make mistakes. I reminded myself of that whenever doubt tried to creep in. The trouble was, I wanted to believe her, perhaps more than I wanted answers. My daughter noticed the change before I did. She came round one Sunday afternoon with a homemade apple crumble. While the kettle boiled, she smiled and asked, "So? When do we get to meet this mystery lady?" "Soon," I replied. "She's coming next month." "That's lovely." She hesitated. "Dad, have you actually met her?" The question irritated me more than it should have. "Not yet." "And you're certain she's who she says she is?" I put my mug down a little harder than I'd intended. "Of course I am. I'm only asking because people our age are being targeted online. I know all about those stories." She nodded gently. "I just don't want anything bad to happen." "It won't." I heard the sharpness in my own voice. The conversation ended there. But the warmth of the afternoon had disappeared. A few days later, my neighbor, Brian, leaned over the garden fence. "How's your lady friend?" "Very well." "Met Harriet?" "Not yet." He scratched his chin. "Just be careful." "David." "That's all." I forced a smile. I know what I'm doing. Or at least I believed I did. Looking back, I realized I wasn't defending Elizabeth because of the evidence. I was defending the future I'd built in my own mind. If she wasn't real, then neither was the happiness I'd been holding on to for months. Then, without warning, everything went quiet. No good morning message. No lunchtime photograph. No call before bed. I told myself she'd probably dropped her phone. The second day passed the same way. Still nothing. By the third evening, I could barely concentrate on the television. I checked my phone every few minutes. I hardly slept. Questions I had never allowed myself to ask suddenly became impossible to ignore. Had something happened? Was she ill? Had she changed her mind? Or had everyone else been right all along? Late on the third night, my phone finally rang. It was Elizabeth. Her voice was trembling. She sounded frightened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I didn't know who else to turn to. Without stopping to question a single word, I believed every one of them. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. All I could hear was her breathing. It sounded uneven, as though she'd been crying. "Elizabeth, the first," I asked quietly. "What's happened?" "I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked. "I never wanted to drag you into this." My stomach tightened. "Just tell me." She took a slow breath before speaking again. "I had to fly overseas after my sister became seriously ill. Everything happened so quickly that I barely had time to think." I listened without interrupting. "When I arrived, my bank froze my accounts because of unusual activity. They say it's routine, but I can't get to any of my money." There was another silence. "I'll sort it out," she continued. I don't know how long it'll take." She didn't ask me for anything. Instead, she apologized. "I hate even telling you this." I found myself trying to comfort her. "These things happen. I'll manage somehow." "You don't sound as though you will." "I've got nobody else." The words settled heavily between us. Nobody else. After everything we'd shared, I couldn't bear the thought of her facing a crisis completely alone. Still, she never mentioned money. She simply sighed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called. I'll work something out." Before I realized what I was doing, I heard myself say the words, "How much do you need?" She hesitated. "No. I can't ask you. You haven't. It's far too much." "Elizabeth." Another pause. "About £2,000. It wasn't a small amount. Even so, I had considerably more in my savings. I'd spent 40 years working as an electrical engineer, putting money aside whenever I could. Margaret and I had always been careful. Helping someone I loved didn't feel reckless. It felt natural. I'll transfer it in the morning. She began crying. Not loudly. Just quiet sobs that made me feel I'd done the right thing. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I promise I'll repay every penny as soon as my accounts are released. I know you will. And next week. Her voice brightened for the first time. I'll finally be there with you. When we ended the call, I slept better than I had for days. The following morning, I drove to my high street bank. The young advisor asked whether I was certain about making an international transfer. Yes. I replied without hesitation. It's for someone important. He nodded politely and completed the transaction. By lunchtime, the money was gone. That evening Elizabeth called again. You've saved me. No. I've only helped. I'll never forget this. Neither did I. A week later she rang once more. Her accounts still hadn't been released. Now there were legal fees connected to paperwork abroad. She sounded embarrassed. I can't believe this is happening. It'll be sorted soon. I'm sure it will. Again. She didn't ask directly. Again. I offered. After that came another setback. Unexpected medical costs for her sister. Then additional travel expenses. Then taxes that supposedly had to be paid before funds could be transferred internationally. Each explanation sounded frustrating rather than impossible. Every problem seemed temporary. Every payment felt like the final bridge between us and the life we'd planned together. Whenever I wondered whether something wasn't quite right, she'd remind me of Christmas by the sea, our walks along Whitby Beach, the little cottage we'd joked about renting for a fortnight. The future always seemed just one obstacle away. By early autumn, I logged into my online banking to check my balance. For the first time in years, I stared at the figures for much longer than usual. The savings account Margaret and I had spent decades building looked alarmingly smaller. I told myself it didn't matter. Money could be earned. Lo was Farah. Just then, my phone buzzed. A message from Elizabeth. I'm so sorry to ask, but I need one last favor. I read the sentence twice, then a third time, for reasons I couldn't explain. A faint knot formed in the pit of my stomach. If this really was the last request, why did it suddenly feel as though something was terribly wrong? I stared at Elizabeth's message for a long time before replying. What is it this time? The answer didn't come straight away. When it finally did, it was shorter than usual. Can we talk? She called within a few minutes. Her voice sounded tired, almost defeated. I'm so embarrassed. David, you don't have to be. I honestly thought everything would be sorted by now. So did I. The solicitor says there's one final payment before my money can be released. I closed my eyes. It wasn't the amount that troubled me. It was hearing the words times one final payment times again. I'd heard something similar before. Still, before I could ask another question, she spoke softly. I understand if you've had enough. I haven't said that. I don't want you thinking I'm using you. The thought barely crossed my mind. Instead, I felt guilty for allowing myself even a moment of doubt. A few days later, my daughter, Sarah, arrived unexpectedly. She was carrying biscuits for tea, but I could tell from her face that something else had brought her round. Dad, she began carefully. Can we have a proper chat? I nodded. She waited until we were both sitting down. How much money have you sent this lady? I felt my shoulders stiffen. That's really none of your business. It becomes my business if someone's taking advantage of you. No one's taking advantage of me. She looked at me with genuine concern. You've never even met her. We've spoken every single day. That's not the same thing. I could hear the frustration in her voice. But all I felt was that she didn't understand. Love at our age wasn't about grand gestures. It was about companionship, about having someone ask whether you'd slept well, someone who noticed when your knee was hurting, someone who cared. Before Sarah left, she said quietly, "Please, just let me look into her. I don't need you investigating my private life. She sighed. I only want to keep you safe. After she went home, I convinced myself she'd overreacted. But she wasn't the only one asking questions. A few evenings later, my son, Michael, rang. Dad, Josh has been having a look online. My grandson was studying computer science at university. He thinks some of her photographs might not be genuine. I laughed, though it sounded forced. He's mistaken. He found pictures that look almost identical on another website. Lots of people use the same sort of photographs. Dad, I trust her. The conversation ended awkwardly, for the first time in years. My children and I weren't speaking as easily as we once had. The following Sunday, they all came round together. Sarah, Michael, even Josh. I knew immediately this wasn't an ordinary family visit. Josh opened his laptop. I've been researching romance scams. I'm not interested. Grundat. Please. He showed me articles describing almost the exact pattern I'd been living through. Widowed victims, daily messages, promises of meeting, unexpected emergencies, requests for money. I pushed the laptop away. You're making this fit because you want it to. We're trying to help you, Sarah said, tears forming in her eyes. No. I stood up. You're trying to tell me the happiest thing that's happened to me in 3 years isn't real. Nobody answered. That silence only made me angrier. Then I said something I regretted almost as soon as the words left my mouth. You all seem far more worried about my savings than my happiness. Sarah looked as though I'd slapped her. Dad, how can you say that? What else am I supposed to think? We'd rather have you penniless than heartbroken. But I wasn't listening anymore. Within minutes, they were gathering their coats. Sarah hugged me before leaving. I barely returned it. When the front door closed, the house felt emptier than it had in months. That evening I told Elizabeth everything. She listened quietly before speaking. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault. They're frightened. They think you're a scammer. She was silent for a moment. Then she whispered, maybe they just don't want us to be happy. The sentence settled exactly where my family's warnings had been. Without realizing it, I chose which voices I wanted to believe. The next morning, I transferred more money. I told myself it would finally solve everything. Just after 8 o'clock that evening, my phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. I answered. Good evening, Sir. The calm voice continued. My name is Sergeant Collins from Nottinghamshire Police. My heart began to pound. Had I just pushed away the only people who were truly trying to protect me? For a few moments, I couldn't answer the officer. I simply sat there, staring at the faded pattern on the sitting room carpet while my heartbeat echoed in my ears. Mr. Harrison. Yes. I appreciate this is difficult, but I need you to listen carefully. His voice remained calm. There was no accusation, only concern. We believe you've been targeted by an organized romance fraud network. I almost laughed. It sounded absurd. You're mistaken. I wish we were. I know this woman. You know the person you've spoken to. That's the same thing. I'm afraid it may not be. He explained that my bank had reported a series of unusually large international transfers that had triggered an investigation. Several other victims had been identified. Most were widowed or living alone. Many had believed they were helping someone they loved. I still refuse to believe it. There has to be some mistake. I understand why you feel that way. No. You don't. I stood up and began pacing the room. She tells me good morning every day. I know. She knows everything about me. I understand. We're planning our future together. The officer paused before replying. Mr. Harrison. None of that proves the person is who they claim to be. The following morning, I agreed to visit the police station. Part of me still believed I'd walk in, answer a few questions, and prove everyone wrong. Instead, they placed a folder on the table. Inside were printed photographs. The smiling woman I'd known as Elizabeth. Then another copy of the same photograph. Only this time it carried a different name. She wasn't from Devon. She lived in Canada. She had never heard of me. The pictures had been stolen from her social media years earlier. I felt the room begin to spin. No. An investigator gently slid another document across the table. The passport you received. I recognized it immediately. It isn't genuine. Then came copies of emails, bank details, payment trails. The accounts I'd been sending money to had already appeared in several fraud investigations, each one linked to different names, different stories, different victims. But I've spoken to her. The investigator nodded. You've spoken to someone. He pressed a button on his computer. Several audio clips began to play. Different victims, different conversations. The voices sounded strangely familiar, almost identical. Our specialists believe the recordings were enhanced using artificial intelligence. He explained. The real speaker's voice has been altered to sound warmer, clearer, and more personal. Every certainty I'd clung to over the past year crumbled in front of me. The late-night conversations, the laughter, the dreams, the promises. None of them meant what I believed they had. Not a single one. I covered my face with both hands. I loved her. Nobody corrected me. Nobody judged me. The silence in the room somehow hurt more than words ever could. After a while, I whispered the question I already knew the answer to. So, none of it was real. The detective answered quietly. The feelings you experienced were real. He paused. The relationship was manufactured to exploit them. Those words broke something inside me. Every memory suddenly changed shape. The necklace, the birthday wishes, the comforting messages after difficult anniversaries, even the words "times I miss you." Had they been copied and pasted to someone else an hour later? I thought about Sarah, Michael, Josh. Every warning I'd dismissed, every argument I'd started, every hug I'd refused. When I finally left the station, I didn't drive home. Instead, I parked outside my daughter's house. I sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before gathering the courage to knock. Sarah opened the door. The moment she saw my face, she knew. I couldn't even look her in the eye. I was wrong. Those 3 words were all I managed before my voice failed. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me exactly as she had when her mother died. No lectures, no anger, just kindness. Dad. She held me a little tighter. Come home. A few days later, the police asked whether I'd be willing to help their investigation by handing over every message, photograph, bank record, and voice note. I looked down at my phone. It contained nearly a year's worth of memories, or what I had once believed were memories. Could I really bear to relive every one of them, if it meant finally uncovering the people who had stolen far more than my savings? Handing over my phone felt strangely like saying goodbye to someone who had died. Every message, every photograph, every voice note. The detectives copied everything while I sat quietly with a paper cup of tea that had long since gone cold. One of them looked up. You've helped us more than you probably realize. At the time, I didn't believe him. All I could think about was the money Margaret and I had spent decades saving, the holidays we'd never take, the security I'd thrown away. But the investigation moved quickly. Over the following weeks, the police contacted me several times, asking about particular conversations and bank transfers. I answered every question as honestly as I could. Sometimes they asked me to listen to old recordings. Hearing those familiar words again was painful. Good morning, my love. I miss you. We'll soon be together. I no longer heard affection, only careful manipulation. One afternoon, Detective Sergeant Collins visited my house. He sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once opened Elizabeth's necklace. We've made significant progress, he said. I looked at him hopefully. Does that mean you've caught them? Part of the network? Yes. He explained that my evidence had been linked with reports from dozens of other victims across Britain. Some lived in Cornwall, others in Yorkshire, Kent and Scotland. Many were around my age. Widowers, people who had simply wanted someone to talk to. Some had lost a few £1,000s. Others had lost almost everything. One gentleman had sold his caravan to help the woman he believed he loved. A retired nurse had emptied her pension savings. Listening to those stories, I realized I wasn't unusual. I wasn't foolish in some unique way. I'd been targeted because I was lonely, because I wanted to believe there was still room in my life for happiness. The criminals had understood that long before I did. Not everyone recovered their money. I certainly didn't. The police managed to freeze a small number of accounts before more funds disappeared overseas. But most of what I'd sent was gone. At first, that truth was difficult to accept. Then I remembered something Margaret used to say: whenever life refused to go to plan, money can be earned again. People can't. She'd been talking about something entirely different, yet somehow the words still helped. A few months later, Sarah asked whether I'd attend a fraud awareness meeting at the community center. I don't think I could. Just come and listen. In the end, I did more than listen. When the organizer asked whether anyone wanted to share their experience, I slowly stood up. My hands shook. I thought it could never happen to me. I began. The room became completely still. I told them about the messages, the promises, the excuses, the shame. When I finished, an elderly gentleman walked over and quietly said, "I nearly sent money to someone last month." He smiled sadly. "After hearing you." I didn't. For the first time since everything had happened, I felt that perhaps some good had come from telling the truth. The embarrassment I'd carried for so long began to lose its grip. I stopped hiding what had happened. If my story could spare one other person the same heartache, then perhaps it still had value. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I spent more time with my children. Josh helped me tighten the privacy settings on my computer. Sarah insisted on Sunday lunches becoming a regular tradition. The laughter around the table gradually returned. Then, one quiet evening, several months later, I was sitting in the conservatory watching the robins peck at the bird table when my phone vibrated. A notification appeared on the screen. A message request from someone I didn't know. "Hello. I couldn't help noticing your lovely smile." For a long moment, I simply looked at the words. Once, they would have filled me with hope. Now they filled me with questions. I rested my thumb above the screen but didn't press anything. Had loneliness finally lost its power over me? Or would fear now stop me from trusting anyone ever again? Several months have passed since I first walked into the police station believing I was about to prove everyone wrong. Life isn't exactly the same as it was before. I don't suppose it ever will be. But it has become quieter in a different way. Not empty, just honest. One crisp autumn morning, I drove to the cemetery, carrying a small bunch of white chrysanthemums. Margaret had always preferred simple flowers. The grass was still damp beneath my shoes as I made my way to her grave. For a few moments, I simply stood there. Then I smiled. "Hello, love." It felt strangely comforting to say the words aloud. I told her everything. About Elizabeth. About the money. About the lies I'd believed. About the police. About Sarah and Michael. Even about the shame I'd carried for so long. I expected to feel embarrassed. Instead, I felt lighter. I was lonely. I admitted quietly. I think that's all it really was. The wind stirred the leaves around the headstone. I found myself remembering something Margaret once told me after we'd celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary. "One day, one of us will have to carry on without the other. Promise me, you won't stop living." At the time, I'd laughed and told her not to be so gloomy. Standing there now, I finally understood what she had meant. Wanting companionship hadn't been a betrayal. It hadn't meant I loved her any less. It simply meant I had loved her deeply enough to miss sharing my life with someone. Loneliness wasn't a weakness. It was the price of love. When I arrived home that afternoon, Sarah and the grandchildren were already in the garden. Josh was repairing the bird table. The younger children were chasing one another across the lawn while pretending to be detectives. Sarah looked up and smiled. Perfect timing. What have I missed? Lunch is nearly ready. For the first time in years, the house felt full again. Not because I'd found another relationship, because I'd found my family again. These days, we see each other far more often. Sunday lunches have become a tradition. Michael rings every Wednesday evening without fail. Josh still helps me whenever my computer decides it's cleverer than I am. I've even started volunteering once a month at the local community center. Speaking to other older people about online fraud, I always tell them the same thing. The scammers aren't looking for foolish people. They're looking for decent people. People who trust. People who care. People who've spent a lifetime believing that kindness should be returned with kindness. That's what makes their crimes so cruel. But I also tell them something else. Real love never asks you to hide it from your family. It never demands repeated financial sacrifices. It never rushes you. And it never makes you choose between the people who have loved you for decades and someone you've never met. I still keep the little silver necklace in a drawer. Not because it reminds me of Elizabeth. It reminds me of the lesson I paid dearly to learn. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I make a cup of tea and sit in the conservatory watching the robins hopping across the garden. I still miss Margaret every single day. I probably always will. But missing someone is no longer the whole story of my life. Before we part, I'd like to leave you with one thought. If you're feeling lonely, please don't suffer in silence. Talk to your family. Speak to a friend. Visit a neighbor. Join a local group. There is no shame in needing company. The only shame belongs to those who exploit that need. And if, tomorrow, someone appeared promising everything your heart has been missing, would you know whether they were offering you love or a beautifully crafted lie?